Hey everyone, and welcome back to Beyond Belief Stories. Today, we're jumping right into an explainer that covers one of the absolute most bizarre, truly terrifying historical mysteries ever recorded. We're traveling way back to the summer of 1518 to a city gripped by a phenomenon so strange, it honestly sounds like something completely made up for a movie. But looking at the historical records, we're talking physician notes, cathedral sermons, and actual city council minutes, this event was very, very real. Just imagine for a second walking out your front door and being gripped by this uncontrollable, violent compulsion to dance. And we're not talking about tapping your toes for a few minutes. We're talking about dancing for hours, and then days, until your feet are literally bleeding and your heart simply gives out. How does something like that even happen? What in the world could compel an entire city population to literally dance themselves to death? All right, so picture this. Our inciting incident begins on July 14th, 1518, with a woman known to history as Frau Truffea. She stepped outside her half-timbered home onto this narrow cobbled street in Strasbourg and just started to dance. But here's the crazy part. As far as we can tell, there was absolutely no music playing. She just began this silent, unceasing, frantic dance. And she kept it up for almost a week. She'd only stop when she collapsed from pure exhaustion, catch a little sleep, and then wake right back up to continue her manic twisting and twirling. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth would this happen? To really get it, we have to set the stage of 1518 Strasbourg. This was a city buckling under an immense, overwhelming amount of psychological and physical stress. They were dealing with 3 straight years of failed harvest, which meant acute famine. On top of that, it was an unbearably hot, dry summer. You've got brutal outbreaks of diseases like leprosy and syphilis, peasant revolts popping off all across the region, and this widespread, suffocating, apocalyptic fear. Basically, the people were starved, terrified, and incredibly superstitious. It was a pressure cooker. And you know how panic spreads, right? Well, in such a fragile, stressed environment, this contagion spread like absolute wildfire. What started as one woman's strange performance rapidly escalated into a full-blown epidemic. Within days, her husband and over 30 other people had actually started mimicking her. By August, the dancing plague afflicted anywhere from 50 to 400 people, and the whole nightmare wouldn't even begin to subside until early September. So there's actually a historical term for this madness: choreomania, or as a lot of folks back then called it, St. Vitus's dance. And I need to be clear here, this wasn't some joyful, fun street party. Observers noted that the victims' eyes were vacant and completely expressionless. They were trapped in this awful trance, and their movements were described as spasmodic, just violent convulsions with their arms thrashing wildly in the air. The sheer physical toll of this was just horrific. Historical accounts tell us that blood would pool into their swollen feet, and they would eventually bleed right through their shoes. Victims would actually cry out for help because they were completely unable to stop themselves. If they didn't succumb to a sudden stroke or a massive heart attack, they'd just collapse from extreme exhaustion, hunger, and dehydration. According to some chronicles, at the absolute peak of this outbreak, up to 15 people were dropping dead every single day. Okay, so what did the local authorities do about this? In a stroke of massive, morbid irony, the local physicians declared this a natural disease of what they called hot blood. And their cure? Get this: sweat it out. The town council literally built stages in the market squares, cleared out the guild halls, and paid professional dancers and musicians to force the afflicted to just dance it out. As you can probably guess, blasting drum beats and pipes at exhausted, dying people only threw fuel on the fire. It created an even greater, deadlier frenzy. When the music and the forced dancing utterly failed, because of course it did, the council totally panicked and banned public dancing and music altogether. Then they pivoted straight back to religious superstition. They desperately loaded all these exhausted dancers into wagons and hauled them up to a mountaintop shrine dedicated to St. Vitus. He was the Catholic saint believed to actually have the power to curse people with a dancing plague. Up there, they outfitted the victims in red shoes, painted with crosses in consecrated oil, sprinkled them with holy water, and read Latin incantations to beg the saint for forgiveness. It was the whole shebang. What's really fascinating here is how the Strasbourg event sits right at this incredible crossroads in history. It perfectly contrasts that old medieval belief in divine punishment directly against the new emerging Renaissance medical theories. So was it God punishing a sinful city, or was it just a massive biological failure of the human body? Let's take a look. Enter Paracelsus, a famous early physician who actually investigated the event shortly after it happened. He completely dismissed the whole saints causing the plague idea. Instead, he's the one who coined the term choreomania. But he also had this wildly misogynistic take, blaming the outbreak on what he called chorea lasciva. He basically claimed that loose women, like Frau Trophia, started dancing purely out of stubbornness just to infuriate their husbands, and that it just spiraled from there. But to be fair to Paracelsus, he also proposed some truly fascinating, somewhat ahead of their time medical theories for the people he deemed innocent. He suggested the existence of laughing veins, where overheated blood caused a ticklish feeling that resulted in uncontrollable movement. Even more accurately, he theorized about the immense power of imagination. He thought that a madness sparked simply by seeing or hearing others dance could kindle the mind like fire to wood, spreading the compulsion from person to person just like a virus. Now, fast forward to modern scientific investigations. Another major theory we absolutely have to explore is ergotism. So ergot is this toxic psychoactive fungus that commonly grows on damp rye stalks, which they used for baking bread back then. It produces chemicals that are actually structurally related to LSD. Consuming it causes severe hallucinations, violent muscle spasms, and this thing called formation. That is the absolutely terrifying physical sensation that thousands of ants are crawling around underneath your skin. Literal nightmare fuel. I mean, it sounds like the perfect explanation, right? Hallucinations and crazy spasms would certainly look a whole lot like a chaotic dance. However, medical historian John Waller completely busts the ergot myth. While ergotism can definitely cause convulsions, people severely poisoned by this toxic mold simply wouldn't have the physical stamina to run outside and dance vigorously for days or weeks on end. They'd be way too weak or suffering from gangrene to maintain that insane level of constant physical exertion. So if it wasn't a biological poison and it wasn't some saint's curse, what actually was it? Well, this brings us to the most widely accepted modern scientific explanation: mass psychogenic illness, which you sometimes hear called mass hysteria. This is a real phenomenon where many individuals suddenly begin exhibiting the exact same bizarre physical behaviors. And it spreads rapidly in an epidemic pattern, triggered not by a virus or a bacteria, but by severe, overwhelming psychological stress. John Waller describes the event as a stress-induced psychosis on a mass level. Think back to those conditions in 1518 Strasbourg we talked about earlier. Pushed completely beyond the brink of human endurance by years of starvation, lethal disease, and deep-seated superstitious terror, the minds of the citizens simply snapped. They fell into a highly contagious collective trance. It was an altered state of consciousness that made them entirely lose their grip on reality, literally acting out the very curses they were most afraid of. As we wrap up today's explainer for Beyond Belief stories, I want to leave you all with a rather haunting thought. We love to think of the people of 1518 as distant, totally different from us, but honestly, human psychology remains fundamentally the same. If extreme environmental stress, fear, and cultural anxieties could cause 400 people to literally dance themselves to death back then, what bizarre collective manifestations could our own modern, relentless pressures trigger today? Something to think about.